Before we begin, I want you to do something simple but significant. Leave a comment with where you're watching from and the exact time your clock shows when these words reach you. Not just the place gives the hour and the minute, because in documented accounts like this, time and location matter. They matter for tracing when these stories surface, how they travel, and the strange patterns that sometimes emerge when certain histories reappear at particular hours, in particular rooms, on particular screens. Fix your moment on that map, and then we'll fix another. The year was 1883, in a stretch of frontier country where winter lingered longer than it should have, and the mountains swallowed sound like a living thing. The settlement didn't yet have a name recognized by any official survey, just a scattering of cabins along a frozen river, a few traps laid in the snow, and a trading post whose ledgers would later become the first point of reference for the case that still unsettles archivists today. The area was a place where men vanished without stirring rumor, where distance and cold ate at the edges of human lives until everything felt temporary. It was the kind of place where a trapper arriving with bundles of pelts wasn't recorded as an event until the pelts weren't animal skins. The man who brought them in appeared sometime in late January, or at least that's what later testimony suggests. The dates in the ledger are smeared with water damage and layered ink that doesn't align with any clerk's handwriting. Witnesses disagreed on his age, his height, and even his accent. Some said he was quiet, speaking only when pressed. Others said he carried himself like someone accustomed to authority. All agreed on one thing. He traveled alone, and his sled carried bundles wrapped too carefully for ordinary trapping. The trading post was run by a man whose name doesn't matter here, only that he kept meticulous records, not out of civic duty, but because the isolation bred a kind of obsession. He wrote down weather patterns, the number of visitors, and descriptions of goods exchanged. His notes from early 1883 show routine entries of salt pork, rifle shot, and lamp oil, until one day a brief notation appears. Unusual hides. Unclassified. The entry is overwritten with another line added later in different ink. Do not catalog. No explanation follows. The clerk's daughter, who was interviewed decades later, said her father refused to speak of that winter. She remembered him burning several ledger pages in the stove, something entirely out of character for him, and she remembered the look on his face when he did it. Fear, she said, but also something else, something like guilt. The first official documentation of the case doesn't come from the trading post, but from a territorial sheriff's report filed 2 months later in a town nearly 40 miles away. The sheriff had been summoned to investigate the disappearance of 2 homesteaders whose cabin was found abandoned, the fire long dead, tools left out as if dropped mid-task. What drew him out wasn't the disappearance. Those were common, but the hide stretched over the homesteader's workbench. According to his report, the texture was wrong, the thickness inconsistent with any known game in the region. He ordered it transported to town for examination. The hide never arrived. The courier tasked with transporting it was found the next morning beside the frozen creek, sled overturned, the hide missing. Tracks in the snow suggested someone had walked alongside the courier for at least a mile before the trail vanished in a cluster of spruce trees. The courier's face, according to the doctor who examined him, bore an expression of extreme terror, though no wounds were found. Around this time, rumors surfaced of a trapper moving through the region, trading selectively, avoiding daylight, and refusing to stay in any settlement longer than necessary. The descriptions were inconsistent, as though the observers couldn't fully recall what they'd seen. Several said the man carried an odor on him, something like iron or cold earth. One described his coat as stitched from patches that didn't match, and another recalled noticing seams so fine they looked more like surgical closures than ordinary leatherwork. The first undeniable evidence came when a group of loggers found a second bundle near a river crossing, this one partially frozen into the bank. The men dragged it out, expecting to find animal pelts, but instead uncovered something that caused 2 of them to abandon the camp that very night. The bundle contained soft, pale, hairless patches stitched together in long strips. Later testimony from the surviving logger stated simply, It was not from any beast. The bundle was transported to a regional magistrate, but the skin decayed with unnatural speed, described as sloughing apart, before it could even be properly examined. The magistrate sealed the case file, though fragments of it survive in county archives. What's unusual is how many documents from that winter appear altered, with pages missing, names crossed out, and dates overwritten. Even more unusual is how often witnesses later claimed they felt watched while discussing the trapper, as if speaking of him summoned something from the tree line. Testimonies from those who encountered him share small, repeating details. The rhythmic sound of metal striking wood somewhere in the distance, a figure seen only at the edge of vision, and the lingering sensation of being followed long after leaving the trails where the trapper was said to travel. One prospector wrote in his journal, "There is a man here who does not walk like a man." Another noted that he found strange cuts on trees, not markings, but strips removed cleanly as if someone were harvesting bark for an unknown purpose. And then there were the disappearances. In January alone, 7 men failed to return from trap lines they'd run for years. Their cabins were found intact, with no signs of struggle, but minor details stood out: boots missing, tools rearranged, and fires extinguished deliberately. In each cabin, investigators found small scraps of hide, thin, pale, and almost translucent, tucked beneath floorboards or caught in splinters of wood. When compared to known game pelts, they matched nothing. By February, apprehension gripped the settlements. Children were kept indoors, and men traveled only in groups. Hunters reported seeing smoke in places where no cabin stood. A solitary figure was glimpsed again and again, moving along the river, leaving no trail in the snow. Something, they said, was out there gathering more than animals. Something was hunting, something was collecting, and the pelts it carried were not from beasts. The first organized search party formed in the second week of February, though organized may be too strong a word for what amounted to a handful of men armed with lanterns, rifles, and a fear they tried not to name. The trading post clerk, who by that point had stopped recording certain transactions entirely, supplied them with provisions. His daughter later recalled that he watched the men depart without speaking, his hand gripping the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white. According to the surviving statements, the search party followed a series of reports describing a lone figure seen traveling upriver at dawn. The figure carried bundles slung over each shoulder, the size and shape of which led several searchers to assume he was transporting pelts to a distant market. But as they moved deeper into the uncut timber, they began finding signs that something was very wrong. The first was a set of footprints, human in shape but unusually long, the stride inconsistent with any normal gait. The second was a campsite discovered near the base of a ridge, the fire still smoldering though no one was present. At the center of the site lay a scraping of tools, a carving knife, a bone saw, and several lengths of sinew. The knife was unusually narrow-bladed, honed to an almost surgical edge. The sinew was worse. It did not match any known animal in the region. One searcher, a seasoned trapper himself, described it as too fine, too pale, too soft. When he picked it up, the rest of the group noticed him recoil as if burned. The men left the camp quickly. Within 24 hours, 3 members of the search party would refuse to continue, citing a sense of being followed. One insisted he heard footsteps behind them at all times, even when the group stopped. Another claimed that while he slept, something brushed the outside of his tent, something tall enough to cast a shadow against the canvas, though the moon was behind the ridge. The remaining men pressed on and reached an old hunter's cabin used intermittently during harsher winters. What they found there would later be described in territorial records as evidence of unlawful mutilation. The cabin door was unlatched, swaying slightly with the wind. Inside, the room was cold, the fire extinguished. On the table lay several sheets of stretched hide. At first glance, the men thought it was deer thin and pale, with faint traces of hair. But as the lamplight moved across the surfaces, details emerged that froze them in place. Wrinkles, folds, slight impressions where the hide had once wrapped around limbs. One piece bore a small blue mark, resembling the kind seen in certain vaccinations of the era. Another scrap showed faint lines, consistent with knuckles. The men backed away, some refusing to stay inside the cabin for more than a moment. A later report indicates that one man, upon recognizing what he was seeing, vomited immediately and fled into the snow. The search party split soon after. Half returned to the settlement to alert authorities. The others attempted to track the trapper deeper into the forest. Only one of those men would survive to give testimony. According to his account, they tracked the figure for nearly a full day, following intermittent footprints and abandoned scraps of sinew. As dusk fell, they noticed shapes hanging from the branches above small, tattered strips of hide fluttering in the wind like crude warning flags. They found a fire ring still warm, the ashes scattered deliberately, as if someone attempted to hide what had been burned. The ashes contained fragments of something that resembled teeth, human teeth. They camped that night in silence, rifles within reach, no one daring to sleep more than a few minutes at a time. The survivor later described hearing a sound he found impossible to forget, a rhythmic scraping, as though someone were sharpening a blade slowly and deliberately in the dark. By morning, 2 of his companions were gone. Their bedrolls were intact, their rifles undisturbed. Snow around the camp was unmarked, except for a single set of footprints leading into the trees. The survivor refused to follow. He ran until his lungs felt ready to split. When he finally reached the settlement, he collapsed, his face pale and lips cracked from cold and fear. The sheriff returned with a larger, more heavily armed group, but the forest had already erased whatever evidence might have remained. The only sign that the missing men had ever been there was a small scrap of hide caught on a branch, thin, hairless, and unmistakably human. What followed was a period of profound unease across the region. Trappers abandoned their lines. Homesteaders barricaded their doors at night. Travelers reported seeing fires in places where no cabins existed. More disturbing were accounts of a figure moving silently through the snow, carrying bundles that shifted slightly with every step. None who witnessed the figure dared to approach. The trading post clerk's ledger entries changed abruptly during this time. Instead of itemized descriptions, he began writing in fragments. Do not trade. Shadows watching. Not alone in the timber. One entry stands out more than any other. He came again. Left something on the step. The entry is followed by a blank page that appears to have been violently torn from the book. What he left has never been confirmed, but several older residents interviewed decades later agreed on one detail. After that day, the clerk began shuttering his windows long before sundown. Meanwhile, stories continued circulating of Pelts unlike anything seen before. Bundles of skin stitched together with skill that defied comprehension. Traders whispered that someone out there was gathering more than animals, something that walked upright, something that could vanish between trees without disturbing snow, something that worked with an almost surgical precision. By late winter, it seemed clear the trapper wasn't simply hunting the wilderness, he was harvesting it, and he had no intention of stopping. The sheriff's office attempted one final coordinated search before the thaw, assembling a group of 12 men, lawmen, trappers, and 2 Army scouts familiar with winter tracking. Their stated goal was simple: locate the trapper, retrieve any evidence, and determine the fate of the missing. But privately, according to a surviving memorandum found decades later in a county archive, the sheriff believed they were pursuing something not rightly human. The memorandum ends with an instruction written in hurried strokes. No one separates, not under any condition. The search party moved upriver, guided by earlier reports of strange lights flickering along the ridges at night. These lights were described inconsistently. Some said lanterns, others said pale fires with no smoke. All agreed that the lights never behaved naturally. They hovered in place too long, winked out too suddenly, and reappeared too far away to belong to a traveling human. By the second day, the men found what they believed to be the trapper's workshop. It was not a cabin nor a camp, but a clearing arranged with unsettling deliberation. Trees had been stripped of bark in long vertical sheets. Stones were stacked in a ring, their surfaces stained with dark, frozen streaks. In the center lay a wooden frame, resembling the kind used for stretching hides, but larger, reinforced with iron pins. The frame held the remnants of a hide so decayed by cold and exposure that the men could not initially identify it. But the sheriff recognized something in the curvature of the remaining strips, something in the faint traces of pores and the pattern of the thinning skin. His notes from that day contain only 5 words. "This was a person once." Several men refused to continue. The group divided, some returning to escort the unwilling back to the settlement, leaving 7 men to press deeper into the timber. These 7 would later be known collectively in the sheriff's reports as the Final Party. Their progress was slow, disrupted by inexplicable phenomena. One scout described hearing footsteps parallel to the group's trail, keeping pace but never coming into view. Another reported seeing a figure between the trees, a tall man wrapped in a heavy coat, carrying bundles over his shoulder. But when he blinked, the figure was gone, replaced by empty snow. The first physical sign that they were nearing the trapper came at dusk, when they discovered a narrow path carved through the snow. The path was lined with objects partially buried beneath ice. At first they appeared to be strips of leather or sinew, but as the men unearthed them, they realized the objects were too uniform and too symmetrical to be animal remains. Several appeared to be lengths of desiccated skin, cut with precise tools, stitched at the edges. One piece contained what the sheriff believed to be a tattoo. At the end of the path stood a crude, low-slung shelter of bark and branches. Smoke curled weakly from a gap in the roof. A set of footprints circled the shelter in a looping, disjointed pattern, as if someone inside had been pacing restlessly for days. The men approached with weapons drawn. Inside, they found no trapper. Instead, the shelter contained dozens of small items, arranged with ritualistic care. Carved wooden pins, lengths of sinew, sharpened bone tools, and fragments of hide. Most disturbing of all was a stack of folded garments, shirts, trousers, and a coat, each cleaned and neatly pressed as though prepared for someone's use. The clothing did not match any found in the region. Beneath the garments lay a journal, its cover stained and curling with frost. The writing inside was a mixture of neat, ledger-style entries and frantic scrawl. Much of it is illegible today, but one repeated line stands out: "The skins remember." As the party exited the shelter, they noticed the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. Snow muffled their steps, but even so, the silence felt heavy, pressing against their ears. One of the scouts whispered that he felt eyes on him from all directions. Another man raised his rifle and aimed at something only he could see. The sheriff ordered the group to stay close. They moved slowly, scanning the tree line, each man aware that the diminishing light was not their ally. Then came the knocking. Rhythmic, deliberate, a pattern of 3 knocks, followed by a pause. The sound echoed from different directions, first from the left ridge, then from the riverbank, then from behind them in the darkness. A scout described it later as the sound of wood being tested, like someone checking whether a tree was ready to take weight. The knocking grew louder, closer. One man panicked and fired blindly. The shot split the air, and then the forest erupted with movement. Branches snapping, something large, brushing past trunks with effortless speed. Lantern light flickered across a tall silhouette just beyond sight. The figure moved in a smooth, gliding motion, too fast for a human burdened by snow. The sheriff shouted for the men to fall back. But before they could regroup, a scream cut through the dark. One of the party, an experienced frontiersman, was gone. His lantern lay crushed in the snow, flame extinguished. Tracks showed he had been pulled into the trees with incredible force. The remaining men retreated toward the river, stumbling through the dark as the knocking intensified around them. Another figure appeared tall and bundled, carrying something over its shoulder. Lantern light caught the edge of the bundle. The sheriff later described seeing the unmistakable outline of a human arm fingers dangling limply. The figure vanished again without leaving prints. By the time the surviving men reached the settlement, only 4 of the original 7 remained. 2 were injured, 1 nearly incoherent. The sheriff was silent. His final report on the incident was brief, offering no theories, only observations. "We did not find a man. We found evidence of his work. The woods were watching. The woods were waiting. The woods were not empty." Witnesses in the settlement claimed that in the nights that followed, smoke could be seen drifting from places where no camp should have been. Bundles hung from branches along the river trail. And always, just beyond torchlight, a tall figure watched without moving, long enough to be seen, never long enough to be approached. The trapper had not fled. He had not been chased away. He had simply moved deeper, continuing his work. And the pelts he carried were no longer the only thing missing from those mountains. The weeks that followed brought a kind of tension the settlement had never known. It wasn't the fear of a predator, nor even the dread of a murderer moving unseen through the timber. It was something quieter, heavier, like the land itself had begun withholding its breath. People noticed small changes first: smoke rising at odd hours from the distant tree line, strange cuts appearing on trees overnight. Thin, precise strips were removed so cleanly that even experienced woodsmen could not replicate them. Children spoke of seeing a tall figure near the river at dusk, though no tracks were ever found in the snow the next morning. Livestock began disappearing without struggle, yet without the telltale signs of wolves or mountain cats. It was as if they simply ceased to exist. The sheriff urged people to stay indoors after sunset, and though the advice was heeded, it did little to stem the rising unease. By early March, the forest felt wrong. That was the wording used in multiple testimonies decades later. Wrong, as if the woods themselves had shifted subtly out of alignment with what the settlers understood. Paths they had known for years seemed unfamiliar. Hollows echoed differently. The silence, once peaceful, now felt predatory. The trading post clerk, whose earlier ledger entries had grown erratic, stopped writing entirely. His daughter would later describe how he sat for hours beside the window, staring toward the timberline as if waiting for something inevitable. One night, she woke to find him standing in the doorway, holding the door ajar as though someone had just knocked. But when she asked who it was, he didn't answer. He simply closed the door, bolted it, and told her never to stand too close to the windows after dark. Around this time, what would later be known as the March reports began circulating statements from people living miles apart, each describing encounters disturbingly similar. A farmer returning from checking his traps claimed he saw a man standing motionless in a shallow creek bed, water flowing around his boots without disturbing the snow on them. A pair of hunters reported hearing footsteps pacing outside their camp all night, though no tracks were found in the morning. A school teacher riding home late saw what she described as a man carrying something heavy across his shoulders, walking without sinking into the snow. These encounters were always fleeting, always distant, and yet always accompanied by a detail that was nearly universal. The figure never reacted to being seen. It simply moved, as though following a pattern older than the settlement itself. The most concrete evidence from this period comes from a set of documents found in the sheriff's effects nearly 30 years after his death. Among them was a folded piece of parchment containing what appeared to be a hastily sketched map. The markings indicated river bends, ridge lines, and several small circles clustered in a remote valley. Next to one of the circles was a note in the sheriff's hand: "Confirm these, not natural." The circles marked locations where unusual hides had been found, some nailed to trees, others partially buried. A separate notation added later reads, "The stitching is identical in all cases." Below that, darker ink. "Not the work of any trapper." On the reverse side of the parchment, a single sentence is written with a trembling hand: "He is making something." No further explanation. In late March, a traveling fur buyer, oblivious to the recent events, arrived in the settlement. He expected to purchase bundles of the usual winter catch: fox, mink, and beaver. Instead, he was met with shuttered windows and wary eyes. The sheriff attempted to convince him to leave immediately, but the buyer insisted on staying. That evening, he reported hearing a rhythmic knocking echoing from the ridge. The sound persisted for nearly an hour, steady and deliberate, neither animal nor mechanical. Despite warnings, he followed the sound the next morning. His footprints were found 2 days later, wandering in erratic patterns before stopping abruptly near a stand of fir trees. There was no sign of him, no torn clothing, no blood, and no signs of struggle. But nailed to one of the trees with a bone-handled awl was a strip of hide, pale, hairless, folded with careful precision. More disturbing still was what the sheriff noted beneath it. The hide bore a partial fingerprint, and that fingerprint matched the missing buyer's left hand. The sheriff ordered a formal search of the valley marked on his map. Only 5 men agreed to accompany him. Their accounts formed the most detailed surviving record of what happened next. They entered the valley at dawn. Immediately, they felt watched. The valley floor was scattered with structures of frames of wood and bone, some upright, others collapsed, all arranged in patterns none of the men could decipher. Strips of hide hung from branches like crude banners. At the far side of the valley stood a crude shelter, larger than the one found earlier. Smoke rose from a hole in the roof. The sheriff approached first, weapon raised. Inside, he found a workbench stained with substances he refused to identify. Tools, bone saws, scrapers, and needles, fashioned from sharpened antler, were laid out with obsessive order. And in the center of the room lay a frame containing a partially stretched hide. It was unmistakable. Human! The sheriff staggered back, barely keeping his composure. But one of the men behind him gasped, not at the hide, but at something in the corner. There, on a folded wool blanket, lay a neatly pressed coat, the fur buyer's coat, cleaned, repaired, and folded with almost reverent care. Beneath it, a journal the buyer had been known to carry, but it was not his handwriting inside. The entries, written in a neat, unfamiliar script, contained only short, cryptic phrases. The patterns are nearly complete. Skin remembers what shape it should take. I am learning. And the final line, need more. As the sheriff turned to leave, he saw a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, tall, still, watching. The figure did not approach. It simply stood, holding a heavy bundle across its shoulders. When the sheriff blinked, the figure was gone. The men fled the valley, none daring to look behind them. That night, a knocking echoed through the settlement again. 3 knocks, a pause, and 3 knocks. The sheriff refused to investigate. He later wrote in the margins of his report, "It does not knock to be let in. It knocks to be acknowledged." By April, it became clear the trapper, if he could still be called that, had no interest in fleeing, no interest in hiding. He was working toward something, completing a pattern. And the pelts he carried through the forest trails were no longer trophies. They were materials. Materials taken from the living. Materials arranged for a purpose no one yet understood. Something was being constructed in those woods, something that required more than animals. By the first week of April, the settlement existed in a state of suspended dread. Days passed in an uneasy silence, and nights were punctuated by sounds no one wished to investigate. Slow footsteps in the underbrush, the creaking of branches bending beneath a weight too deliberate to be the wind, and the now familiar rhythmic knocking that came in patterns no one could decipher. The sheriff's reports from this period grow increasingly fragmented. His handwriting, once firm and orderly, begins to waver. Margins contain stray notes. Not alone in woods. He watches daylight as if it offends him. 3 more dogs gone. A separate page bears only a single sentence. The hides are not trophies. He is trying to rebuild something. What happened next was pieced together decades later from fragments of diaries, missing persons notices, and one particularly chilling letter found inside the walls of a cabin that burned in 1901. The event that forced the settlement into collective action, occurred on April 9th. According to the surviving record, two brothers, ages 14 and 17, failed to return from checking their trapline on the riverbank. They were experienced woodsmen, raised in the frontier, the kind of boys who could navigate by sound more than sight. When they failed to appear by dusk, their father went searching. He found their tracks leading toward the river as expected, but then veering sharply north, a direction neither boy would have taken in daylight, let alone nearing nightfall. The tracks were steady, unhurried. No signs of struggle, side by side, as if the boys were following something. The father tracked them until the snow grew patchy near the low marsh. There, in a strip of mud, he found a single additional footprint, a man's, bare. The impression was deep, yet the edges remained sharp, as though the foot that formed it had been unnaturally cold. The boys were never found. But the following dawn, strips of hide, thin, pale, and unmistakably human. They were discovered hanging from willow branches near the marsh. And in the center of the clearing, resting on a flat stone, lay two small objects: a carved whistle belonging to the younger boy and the elder's pocket knife, polished clean, without a speck of blood. The settlement could no longer pretend this was a matter for one sheriff. A search party of nearly 30 men assembled, all armed, all grimly aware of what they might find. Their stated goal, according to the sheriff's notes, was to locate the trapper's cabin and put an end to these outrages. But even those determined words did not reflect what many privately feared, that the trapper was less a man and more an expression of something older and darker moving through the wilderness. The valley where the worksite had been discovered was their first target, but when the party arrived, the clearing was gone. Not empty, gone. Trees stood where structures had been only a week prior. Fresh growth covered what had been bare ground. No hide frames, no tools, no fire pit, as though the forest had grown back overnight. The only sign they were in the right place was a circular pattern of stones that had not been there before, and, at the very center, a thin braid of hair. Human hair, bound with sinew. One of the men vomited. Another whispered, "He knows we're here." From here, the testimonies become contradictory. Some reports claim they heard footsteps pacing just beyond the tree line. Others describe distant shapes, moving too quickly, too fluidly to be human. One man insisted he saw a figure crouched in the branches above them, watching with an unnatural stillness. But all accounts agree on what they found next. Hidden beneath a jagged shelf of rock at the base of the ridge was a narrow opening just large enough for a person to crawl through. The sheriff ordered 2 lanterns lit and entered first. Inside, the passage widened into a cavern. On the walls hung dozens of crude pelts. At first, the men believed them to be animal hides. Then they saw that the patterns, the textures, and the faint impressions of pores and hair follicles were wrong. Terribly wrong. These were human skins, processed, stretched, and tanned, with craftsmanship bordering on reverence. Some had tattoos, some bore scars, some were unmistakably from children. A journal lay on a stone shelf, the pages stiff with cold. The writing appeared to be the same meticulous script found in the valley shelter. The entries grew increasingly elaborate, describing not killings but reductions. The removal of the skin while keeping the rest alive, only long enough to learn what it remembers. One passage read, "The body is crude, the skin is essential. It knows the shape it must return to." Another read, "I need a face with clarity, a face remembered by many, a form that will hold." The sheriff slammed the journal shut before the men could read further. As they left the cavern, one man noted later that a laborer named Bromley claimed he saw something on the ridge above them, a figure standing upright, watching, draped in a patchwork of stitched hides. The lantern light flickered, and the figure appeared to shimmer, as though the very outline of its body were uncertain. Then, without sound or movement, it was simply gone. That night, the sheriff wrote a final entry in his log before the settlement fell silent for nearly 3 consecutive days. That entry reads, "He is not collecting, he is building, a shape, a skin, one that belongs to the forest, not the man underneath." On April 12th, the knocking returned. But this time, it came from every direction at once. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 knocks, a pause. Not at doors, but on trees, on walls, on the very ground. As if announcing that the pattern was nearly complete. As if the figure stitched from stolen skins was ready to step fully into the shape it had been preparing since winter's first freeze. And somewhere in the forest, lantern light was seen moving in a slow, deliberate path, carrying something heavy over a reconstructed shoulder. By the morning of April 13th, the settlement had divided itself into 2 groups. Those who barricaded their homes and refused to step outside, and those who believed they had a duty, or perhaps an obligation born from terror, to understand what was moving in the woods. The sheriff belonged to the latter. His notes from that day reveal a man pushed to the edge of reason, yet still methodically documenting each detail as though the act of writing could impose order on something fundamentally outside human understanding. In one margin he wrote, "Patterns repeating. He responds to the land, not to pursuit." Another line, scratched hard enough to nearly pierce the page. "He is assembling a single skin, not from one body, but from many." That same afternoon, 3 men who lived on the outskirts of the settlement failed to return from gathering firewood. Their disappearance happened in full daylight, within earshot of nearby homes. One witness reported hearing a man call out in a strange, hollow voice, familiar yet mismatched, like a voice spoken through an ill-fitting mask. The witness claimed the voice said, "Help me," though the tone was flat, without urgency or pitch. He followed the sound only a few steps before realizing it did not echo correctly. It lacked depth, direction, and origin. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He returned home trembling, unsure whether he had heard a man or something imitating one. When a small search group was formed at dusk, the sheriff led them toward the last known location of the missing men. They moved cautiously, lanterns held low, trying to avoid casting attention-grabbing light into the forest. The woods were unnervingly silent. No insects, no wind, no movement. Even the trees felt rigid, as if bracing themselves. A quarter-mile from the wood line, they found something dangling from a branch about 12 feet high. A hide, stretched and cut into a perfect oval. Its edges were smoothed with a care that made several men step back in revulsion. The hide had eye holes, not crude slashes, but carefully shaped openings, as if intended to be worn. The sheriff noted in his log, the face was not a mask, it was a study, a draft. Beneath the hanging hide, pressed into the snow, were bare, elongated toes digging deep into the crusted surface. The prints walked in a tight circle, as if the figure had paced beneath the tree for hours. But what made several men drop their lanterns in panic was the fact that each repeated footprint was identical. Not similar, identical. The exact same pressure, the same depth, and the same angle, as though the foot did not fatigue or shift its weight. As though something had learned how to make the impression of a human step but had not learned variation, the sheriff ordered the men to withdraw. But what happened next was recorded by 5 separate witnesses and later corroborated by scattered accounts across decades. From the tree line ahead came a faint sound, slow and methodical, like a wet hide being pulled taut. Then a shape emerged between the trees. It was tall, thin, and draped in a crude mantle of stitched skins, each piece taken from a different body, creating a patchwork of mismatched tones, textures, and even ages. The figure's limbs were long and jointed incorrectly, as though rebuilt by someone who understood anatomy only through observation, not experience. Its face, if it could be called that, was no face at all. A stretched sheet of tanned hide had been fitted loosely over an underlying skull-like structure, but the eye holes did not align. The mouth opening was twisted, slightly off-center, as though the creator had studied human proportion but misunderstood the subtleties of expression. The sheriff later wrote, "It was trying to become something it was not, The creature did not charge. It did not attack. It merely watched. A terrible stillness emanated from it, as though it was waiting not for prey, but for understanding. When one of the men raised his rifle, the sheriff struck the barrel downward. A single shot, he feared, would accomplish nothing except provoke. The creature tilted its head at the movement, the skin around its neck folding unnaturally. Then it slowly extended its arm. In its hand, long fingers wrapped too tightly around the object it held, a newly cleaned, bone-handled tool. The handle bore the initials of the trapper who had disappeared months before. The creature dropped the tool into the snow. Then, in a voice that sounded wrong, too deep, too thin, too mismatched with the shape standing before them, it said a single word. More. The men fled, stumbling over each other in their panic. The sheriff remained a moment longer, unable to tear his gaze from the creature. Its body shuddered, as though the skins draped over it were breathing independently. Its form seemed uncertain, flickering between proportions, as though it was still adjusting, still stitching, still learning what a human body should be. When it stepped forward, the sheriff finally turned and ran. Back in the settlement, panic erupted. Doors were barricaded, lamps extinguished, and prayers whispered until dawn. The sheriff tried to organize a defensive perimeter, but no one would stand guard at the forest's edge. Not after what they had seen, not after hearing the words spoken by something whose mouth had no true shape. That night, the knocking returned, but instead of the familiar 3-and-3 pattern, it came in a long, steady sequence that was measured, deliberate, and almost instructional, as though the creature were communicating, as though it was demonstrating how the pattern should sound when completed. The sheriff wrote, "It is building a body. But why? For whom?" In the early hours of morning, the answer became clearer. Lantern light was seen again near the ridge, but this time it was not wandering. It moved with purpose, intent, direction, and the heavy burden it carried no longer sagged like a collection of hides. It held shape, human shape, but the skin covering it was not yet complete. The creature was assembling something it intended to inhabit fully, and it needed more material to finish its work. By the dawn of April 14th, the forest no longer felt like a boundary beyond the settlement. It felt like an encroaching force, an intelligence pressing inward, as though studying the people who had dared carve lives along its edge. The sheriff, who had slept no more than an hour, wrote a final coherent summary before his entries dissolved into scattered notes. He carries a form now, not yet complete, not yet fully inhabited. Something prepares to step into it. What unsettled him most were the reports that began arriving that morning. Not of attacks, not yet, but of mimicry. A woman claiming she heard her husband calling her from outside the cabin at dawn, even though he was seated beside her. A child swearing he saw his mother walking near the barn, despite her being asleep inside. Voices that sounded familiar when heard from a distance but shifted strangely as they drew nearer, like someone copying a sound without understanding its cadence or emotion. The sheriff instructed everyone to ignore any voice they heard outside their homes unless they could physically see the speaker. It was an instruction that likely saved lives. Around midday, a pair of woodcutters, known for their skepticism, reported seeing a figure crouched on a ridge above them. At first, they believed it to be a wounded traveler wearing mismatched furs. But as it began to descend the slope, using its hands to steady itself, the movement immediately struck them as unnatural. The arms were too long, the joints bent at slight but unmistakably wrong angles, and the face, though arranged to suggest human features, shifted subtly as though the skin covering it did not yet fit. The woodcutters fled. When they reached town, they described the face as an attempt. That was the word they both used. An attempt at looking human. This was the point at which, in the sheriff's account, panic overtook reason. Men who had previously agreed to mount a final search now refused to leave their homes. Others argued they should burn the forest itself, an impossible idea, but one that revealed how deeply the creature's presence had rattled them. And then, as the community argued, the knocking began again. But this time, It did not echo across the settlement. It was coming from only one place, the abandoned blacksmith shop near the river. Slow, steady, measured, 3 knocks, a pause. 3 knocks, a pause. Exactly the pattern that had been heard for weeks. The sheriff gathered a small group and approached the shop. The knocking ceased the moment they stepped into view. The door, which had been firmly shut the day before, now hung slightly open. The sheriff entered first. Inside, the forge was cold. Tools lay scattered on the floor, and on the central workbench lay something wrapped in hide. Not stretched or bundled, carefully folded. He unwrapped it slowly, expecting another pelt. Instead, he found a face. Or rather, a mask shaped from human skin, but with features that appeared too symmetrical, too precise, as if refined repeatedly until the creator believed it had achieved a perfect human likeness. Yet the eye holes were empty, and the inside, when the sheriff lifted it, was coated with a thin layer of oil and ash, as though it had been worn recently. One of the men dropped his lantern. The sheriff ordered everyone out. But before they could leave, a sound came from behind the building. Soft footsteps moving through soil, followed by a dragging noise. When the sheriff looked through the slats of the far wall, he saw something standing at the water's edge. A figure wearing the pale, unfinished skin drape they had seen the night before. But now it stood differently. Straighter, taller, its movements smoother. It held the newly cleaned face in its hands, turning it, studying it, as if determining whether it matched the body it was assembling. Then, slowly, the creature pressed the face against its own unfinished head. The hide adhered instantly, as though the two pieces recognized one another, as though they belonged together. The sheriff's next note read, "It is choosing who to become." That afternoon, the settlement gathered in the church. Every family, every rancher, every child. The sheriff addressed them with the stark truth he had tried to avoid stating plainly. It is not hunting for food. It is hunting for likeness. It was the first time he allowed himself to speak the possibility aloud that the creature was constructing a perfect human covering, not simply for disguise, but to pass among them, to blend, to move without being noticed. That evening, multiple families reported the same sight. A lone figure observing from the tree line as dusk settled. Not hiding, not stalking, observing. Its height matched no one in the settlement, yet its proportions were becoming increasingly human. One man described its silhouette as almost right. Another said it looked like someone wearing a person. But the most chilling testimony came from the schoolteacher, who had been among the first to witness strange movements earlier in the winter. She claimed the figure was practicing gestures, turning its head in studied motions and shifting its weight from one leg to the other as though rehearsing, as though learning how to be among them. At sunset, a farmhand burst into the sheriff's office with a tremor in his voice. "It knocked on my door," he said my name, my voice, exactly my voice. When asked what he did, he replied, "I told it to go away." "And?" the sheriff asked. The farmhand swallowed. "It didn't walk away. It folded backward into the dark." The sheriff wrote one final coherent line in his log that night. "It is no longer simply building a body. It is preparing to join us." On the morning of April 15th, bare footprints, perfectly formed, each identical to the others, were found circling nearly every home on the settlement's edge. Identical spacing, identical depth, like stamps pressed into snow, and where the prints ended, a single message was carved into the bark of the old ash tree at the center of town. A message written in a perfect imitation of the sheriff's handwriting. Ready. At first light on April 16th, a thin layer of snow had fallen, an unexpected late-season dusting that settled over rooftops, fences, and the long stretch of frozen ground between the settlement and the dark timberline. Snow had always been regarded as a kind of truth-teller in the frontier territories, revealing tracks that otherwise would have remained invisible. Yet that morning, the sheriff noted quietly in his log that truth was the one thing the settlement feared most. No one wanted to step outside and see what the snow had recorded, but they had to. Because inside the church, where the entire community had gathered through the night, few had slept. Mothers held their children. Men watched every window. Lanterns burned low, shadows moving steadily around them as if urging them toward dawn. Just after sunrise, the sheriff ordered the doors opened. A dozen men, rifles clenched tight, stepped into the brittle morning air. For several long seconds, no one breathed. At first, the snow appeared undisturbed, a clean, pale sheet stretched across the settlement. But then, as the men moved down the main road, they began to see patterns of circular sweeps made in the night, as if something had moved silently from house to house. Tracks, but not the deep, compressed footprints of a person. No, these tracks were shallow, light, and precise, as if the thing that made them carried no weight at all. It passed by every home, one man whispered. Every single one. The sheriff corrected him. Not past, he said softly. Paused. Because each set of light, bare imprints stopped directly in front of a window or door, perfectly centered, as though the creature had stood there for long moments, watching the occupants inside, judging them, measuring them, choosing. That was the word the sheriff finally allowed himself to write. Choosing. Near the schoolhouse on the northwest corner of the settlement, louder shouts broke the morning hush. The men rushed over. Outside the building, the snow was disturbed by something far larger than footprints. Drag marks carved a long trough around the structure, wide, deep impressions that crossed over themselves repeatedly. The sheriff knelt and placed his hand inside the track. The snow had melted there, forming a shallow pool of slush. Heat. Whatever had moved around the schoolhouse had radiated heat. The men exchanged glances. The creature was no longer cold, no longer something that slipped through the night like an unfinished shape. It was becoming alive in ways it had not been before. A shout echoed from behind the schoolhouse. One of the ranch hands had found something frozen upright in the snow, something that caused even the most hardened men to recoil. It was a deer, or what remained of one. The body stood balanced on its hind legs, frozen in a grotesque posture as if it had been lifted and placed there like a sculpture. But the skin had been removed entirely, peeled in a single meticulous layer, leaving the musculature exposed but eerily intact. The hide was nowhere to be found. The sheriff closed the animal's hollow eye sockets with his glove. "It's practicing," he muttered. "Learning." That was when a second call went out, this one from the blacksmith's apprentice. He pointed shakily toward the tree line. Hanging from a branch was something long, thin, fluttering slightly in the cold breeze. A strip of hide, human hide, cleaned, stretched, scraped, and treated with some kind of oil that gave it a pale, waxy sheen. The sheriff climbed up and cut it down. When he unrolled it, the men around him turned away. It had pores, a faint line where a spine would have been, the unmistakable curve of a shoulder. It was a section of a human back, a portion of someone's skin, but the texture was wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, too uniform. "Not human?" a man finally whispered. The sheriff exhaled slowly. "No human, but not from any living person." And then he understood. It was constructing the body it wanted, piece by piece, from remnants of its earlier prey, from scraps of what it had already taken, from victims long dead or long forgotten, reassembling them, refining them, returning to its earliest killings and reclaiming what it needed. No one saw the next discovery being made until a young boy tugged at the sheriff's coat and pointed past the old well, where the creature had first been spotted. In the distance, just beyond the low rise that marked the northern edge of the settlement, something stood watching them. A figure tall enough to be seen from far away, nearly motionless against the softly falling snow. A human silhouette, shoulders, arms, a head. The proportions were now nearly exact. The sheriff raised his rifle, but the figure made no movement to flee. Instead, it lifted one arm slowly and carefully and mimicked the motion of a wave. A greeting. A gesture too precise, too deliberate, like a performance studied and repeated until perfected. Then the creature took a step forward, not gliding, not folding, not shifting through the world as it once had, walking. A human walk, a practiced walk, and the sheriff realized something with such clarity that he later described it as a moment that burned itself into the bones. Whatever stood at the edge of the settlement was not trying to hide. It was showing itself, testing the completeness of its construction, demonstrating what it had become. Becoming human was not its disguise. Becoming human was its goal. The sheriff ordered everyone back inside the church immediately. Doors were barred, windows covered. But even as they hid, even as men clutched their rifles and women held their children close, they could not stop hearing it. That same slow, steady knocking. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. A pause. Except now, it came not from an old shop or a distant cabin. It came from their doors. One by one, in no particular order, a knock for every home. A signal to each resident. A calling. Then, in the sheriff's final note of the day, it has finished what it was making, and now it seeks to join its maker. By the morning of April 17th, the settlement had become a place of whispers. Quiet, fractured, trembling. No one dared step outside, not after the endless knocking that had continued through the night in patterns too deliberate to be random and too perfectly spaced to be human. The sheriff sat at the front of the church, near the pulpit, staring at the frost gathering along the inside of the windows. He had not written in his log since the entry from the night before. The ink had frozen in its bottle. He warmed it between his palms as he waited for the lanterns to burn out or for daylight to push its way through the snow-clouded sky, whichever would come first. When dawn finally arrived, it brought with it a kind of deadened calm. The knocking had stopped. The air held its breath, and that deep, absolute silence was worse than any sound they had heard since the first reports of the trapper's unusual pelts months earlier. The sheriff gathered a small group, the same men who had accompanied him during the first search upriver. None spoke. Each carried a rifle. Each carried the knowledge that they were no longer hunting an animal nor fleeing a monster. They were confronting something that believed itself ready to be seen. Snow crunched softly under their boots as they moved toward the northern edge of town. The footprints from the day before the perfectly formed, identical ones were gone. In their place were new tracks, heavy ones, deeper, more human. The sheriff crouched and placed his hand inside one. The depth was precise, as though a person weighing exactly the same as any adult man had stepped there. But the shape was wrong. Human in outline, yes, but too symmetrical, too mathematically perfect, as if the foot had been carved rather than grown. As they followed the trail toward the ridge, the tracks doubled, then tripled, creating a weave of footprints that suggested pacing, circling, and practicing. The way a child might practice handwriting until every stroke looked identical. When they reached the ridge, they found a clearing they had not noticed before. A circle of flattened snow approximately 30 feet across. In the center lay another pelt stretched, cleaned, and treated, except this one was different. This one was not made from a human fragment or an animal. This one was made from clothing. Dozens of garments stitched together with sinew and hide, a patchwork of shirts, jackets, and trousers, all fused into a single, unsettling layer, like an outer shell meant to sit atop the human-like skin beneath it. The sheriff picked it up with the tip of his rifle. It was warm. And beneath it, pressed into the snow, was something far worse. A mask. A face. Not unfinished like before. Not symmetrical like the ones found earlier. This one, this mask, was flawed. Slightly asymmetrical nose. Soft imperfections around the mouth. A faint scar along the brow that looked accidental. It looked real. Humans are real. As though the creature had studied imperfection, understood that true humanity required it, and crafted a face that carried the irregularities of an actual person. "Whose face is that?" someone whispered. The sheriff stared at it a long time before answering. "It's no one's. It's everyone's. Because the face was not recognizable, not taken from a single victim. It was a composite, a perfect imitation of humanity, created not by copying a person, but by copying the idea of a person. As if the creature had studied the settlers one by one and sculpted a face that blended all of them together. A face that would not draw suspicion if seen from a distance or in dim light. A face that could pass. That realization chilled the sheriff more than any winter storm. As they stood in the clearing, one of the men stiffened suddenly. "Someone watching us," he whispered. "There," and he pointed to the tree line. Between two pines, a figure stood still, tall, its posture unnaturally elegant. Not hunched, not twisted. Perfectly upright, not shadowed. Not concealed. Made to be seen. The men raised their rifles, but the sheriff lifted a hand to stop them. "If it wanted to kill us, it would have done so months ago," he said. "It doesn't want death. It wants an entry." The figure stepped forward. The men stepped back. It paused, tilting its head with subtle curiosity. Then it repeated a gesture they had seen before, a wave. But this time, the hand moved naturally. Too naturally. The sheriff spoke to it, though later he admitted he did not know why. "What do you want?" The creature did not answer. It simply lowered its hand, turned its head slightly as though listening to something distant, and walked into the trees, vanishing between the trunks with steps so smooth, so human, that for a moment the men wondered if it had been a person after all. But the sheriff knew better. That night the settlement held another vigil inside the church. No one slept. The knocking did not return. But several families reported hearing footsteps around their homes. Slow, steady, and unhurried. As if the creature were no longer testing its gait, but demonstrating it. At midnight, the schoolteacher spoke up for the first time since the ordeal began. Her voice shook as she addressed the sheriff. "It has built a body. But why? Why go to such lengths?" The sheriff stared into the lantern flame. "Because it wants something only humans have," he said. "A place among others." The schoolteacher swallowed. "You mean it wants community?" The sheriff shook his head slowly. "Identity. Because true identity requires recognition, requires belonging, requires other minds to affirm one's existence. And the creature had none of that. Not until it finished its construction. Not until it built a form the human mind could accept. When the lanterns finally burned out, the sheriff wrote his final entry of the night. "We thought it hunted us for our bodies. We were wrong. It hunted us for our shape." The line that followed was shakier. And now that it has achieved it, what comes next is not a matter of tracking a beast. It is a matter of finding a man. The morning of April 18th arrived without birdsong, without wind, without any natural signal that the world beyond the settlement still moved, as it always had. Snow lay untouched across the fields, but everyone inside the church knew the stillness was a disguise, an intentional quiet, like the breath held by something watching. The sheriff stood near the door with his rifle across his chest. He had not spoken since the night before. When the first rays of weak sunlight pushed against the frosted windows, he finally motioned for the men to follow him. No one wanted to go. Everyone understood that whatever waited outside was no longer a creature learning to mimic humanity. It was something that believed it had completed the transformation. It had studied the shape of their bodies, the cadence of their speech, and the patterns of their routines. It had watched the settlement through winter, through hunger, and through fear. And now, for the first time, the sheriff suspected it might no longer merely be observing from the timberline. It might be standing among them. When they stepped onto the main road, the town was still. But near the well, where the earliest signs had been found months before, they discovered fresh prints. Human prints. Perfect prints. And next to them, a second set, slightly irregular, slightly off-center, like footsteps mimicking imperfection. As if two figures had stood there, one real, one learned. The sheriff crouched and touched the edges of the prints. They were warm. "It's moving openly now," he whispered. "In daylight." The men looked toward the woods, expecting to see the tall figure watching from the shadows as it had for days. But the forest remained silent, empty. That was when the boy, the same child who had first noticed the creature practicing gestures weeks earlier, grabbed the sheriff's coat. "I saw someone," he stammered, "walking toward the riverbank. Looked like one of us." The sheriff tensed. "Who?" The boy swallowed. "I don't know, but they waved at me." And the wave looked wrong. The sheriff gathered the men and made for the river. As they approached, the sound of water grew louder, steady, and cold. The river cut a wide band through the valley, bordered by stone outcroppings. Mist rose from the surface, and at the bend, half shrouded in fog, stood a figure. A man. Or something shaped to resemble one. He wore the patchwork clothing skin the sheriff had found the day before, draped perfectly across the shoulders. His hands were folded neatly in front of him. His posture was calm, his head tilted as though listening. When the sheriff called out, "Show yourself," the figure turned slowly. And the face it wore, the face was ordinary, perfectly ordinary. Not monstrous, not stretched, not twisted, a plain man's face, a face with subtle asymmetry, faint imperfections, and a hint of weathering across the cheeks. A face made intentionally to be unremarkable. So unremarkable that the men felt their minds trying to assign it a name, someone they must have met, must have traded with, or must have passed on the road at some point. The creature had understood something fundamental. Humans fear the monstrous, but they rarely fear the familiar. The sheriff stepped forward alone. "What are you?" The figure did not answer. It blinked once, slowly, and then took a step closer. The sheriff raised his rifle. The creature stopped. And then, with calm, precise movements, it raised its hand and placed it against its own chest, mimicking a human gesture of greeting, of peace, or perhaps ownership. The sheriff shook his head. "You're wearing a face," he said, "not a living one." The figure tilted its head slightly, as though considering the accusation. Then it parted its lips as if preparing to speak. And the voice that came out was not monstrous. It was the sheriff's, perfect, clear. "Help me," it said. The men behind him froze. It was the exact intonation, the exact timbre, and the exact rhythm of the sheriff's voice when he called his men to attention, a practiced echo. The sheriff did not move. After a long silence, he lowered his rifle, not out of trust, but out of a terrible realization. "It isn't trying to replace us," he whispered. "It's trying to be recognized by us." Because recognition meant acceptance. Acceptance meant integration. And integration meant that it would no longer be an outsider, a threat, or a thing to be hunted. It would become part of the settlement's identity, woven into it as naturally as any new arrival, which meant the true danger wasn't attack. It was belonging. Without warning, the creature took another step forward. Too close now, too precise, too silent. The sheriff fired. The figure fell backward into the snow. But as the men approached, rifles raised, the sheriff stopped them with a single outstretched hand. The body lay perfectly still, no twitch, no breath. The sheriff knelt and touched the face skin. It was soft, warm, too warm for something newly dead. Then the warmth began to fade. The edges of the skin loosened. The shape beneath collapsed, flattening, deflating, as though the interior had never been flesh at all, but something suspended in tension, something that only held its shape while the creature inhabited it. The sheriff stepped back. "It's not dead," he whispered. "It left this shell behind." The men looked around them, into the forest, into the mist, into every shadow cast across the snow. But the woods remained silent, watching. Later that night, the sheriff wrote his final entry. "It understands us now. It knows our forms, our gestures, our voices, our customs, our limits. It may already walk among us, wearing another face, or none at all. We will never know." The entry ends there. No signature, no date. The page following it is torn out completely. For years after, the settlement's records refer to unexplained sightings of strangers passing through, who fit no description on any census roll, men who waved in ways that felt slightly rehearsed, and travelers whose footprints were perfectly even, perfectly spaced, and too identical to be natural. And each time, the sheriff's last written warning was repeated in hushed tones around the hearth. It wanted not our bodies, not our lives. It wanted our shape. Whether the creature ever left the mountains, or whether it walks still, passing unnoticed through towns that never knew to fear a face too ordinary, remains a matter of folklore, of archive, of testimony whispered across generations. But the logbooks preserved from the settlement contain one chilling detail, written years later in a different hand. Every 20 winters, a new set of perfect footprints appears near the old well. A reminder, a return, or an inheritance. And if the records are correct, the next winter in the cycle is not far off. If you want to follow more long-form investigations like this, stories where history, folklore, and documented accounts intersect in unsettling ways, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next case.